Interesting, most smart city conferences are very heavy on tech and business and a little bit lighter on equity and public sector. So it's great that we're now on this last day going to hear from some of the global leaders in industry. We've got infrastructure represented with Verizon. We've got advanced mobility with Lyft, and Stonely with Urban Us and Urban X is going to represent the perspective of emerging companies that are building into this space. And we're going to make sure that we reserve about 10 minutes at the end of this discussion for your questions. So start teeing those up. We've got 2 mics, so when you have a question at around a little after 10, feel free to move to the mic so that we can recognize you. Great, so with that, we're going to lead off with Rick from Verizon. And Rick, so tell us what the smart city means to you and what is coming from Verizon and the infrastructure companies in the next few years.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having or giving Verizon an opportunity to sit at this panel. When it comes to smart cities, I think if you ask 10 people at any given table here, you're going to probably come up with at least 15 different answers for what smart cities mean. It's an interesting definition, especially from our perspective in the industry. For me, it's a digitally served constituency. I mean, that's what it's about, is to be able to serve these citizens, allow them to interact with all facets of their government, proactively, reactively, via a digital means. For monitoring air quality in the neighborhoods, I know there's been some great projects here in Portland around that, to free Wi-Fi on buses for students, all the way to connected traffic to improve traffic flow throughout the region. But when it comes to the infrastructure piece, that's what we're focused on. And smart city applications and solutions are like holiday ornaments on a Christmas tree, is how we like to look at it. And without the tree, there's nowhere for the ornaments to hang on. So in order to have, to make a tree a Christmas tree, you got to have the network in place. So I know I'm doing a terrible job in describing that analogy, but the focus is we need to build a network that can not only support today's demands for the users and their growing needs for unlimited data, but also be prepared for all the IoT and smart city devices that are about to hit our network.
Great. Stonely, you work in the urban tech space, as you described that. First, can you help us understand what that means and how it connects to smart cities, and maybe discuss a little bit about some of the technologies and applications that you see emerging?
Thanks for having me, Matt, and for welcoming me here. So I think very early on when we started our fund, we're an early stage investor in companies that are solving city challenges at the intersection of climate change and urbanization. And the emerging trend and label around the sector was smart cities. This is about 4 years ago. And our investigation of the space suggested that mostly what people were talking about were top-down, sensor-driven deployment of governance and providing services to a city. Whereas what we thought was more interesting were the possibilities for emerging technology companies to help shape cities themselves. And so we started calling it urban tech, short for urban technology, to differentiate from what was primarily focused on delivering services, whereas urban tech is focused on enhancing the city from the bottom up. And we believe that the future of cities, the things that will come to define life and work and transportation around cities are things that are being born today, created by entrepreneurs.
So can you just give us an example of 1 or 2 of the companies that you folks have invested in or looked at that relates to this space? Sure.
So interesting, I was at a impact investor dinner yesterday evening, and they did a really fun way of introducing ourselves. One was a fun fact, and a gentleman went on for, I'd say, almost 5 or even 10 minutes about a device that he uses to get around his neighborhood called the One Wheel, and it's a small electric vehicle. It looks like a skateboard, but it's got a giant thick wheel in the middle of it, and I've never heard someone go on that long with that much passion about a product. Maybe the iPhone, but this is somebody who is raving about how enjoyable mobility in his neighborhood and in the city is for him because of this consumer device that when we invested in One Wheel 4 years ago, we knew the secret master plan of the founder was that this sort of use would ultimately be what defines the company, the enabling urban transportation. But the way that it was introduced to the world was as a extreme sport or as a hobby. And so without any urban planners or transit planners, with no top-down analysis, this small company in Santa Cruz was able to introduce a new form of mobility that creates a level of raving fandom I've just never seen. And this is just one example. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we recently invested in a company, a woman who started her career building energy efficiency and renewable energy projects at Google, an early employee there, and went on to do the same for Richard Branson, and ultimately went into venture at Lennar. Robin is her name, and she recently started a company with a few other stellar co-founders that is focused on taking commercial buildings and flipping the concept of investing in renewables on its head. And as opposed to leasing out roof space or just trying to save money on your bill, Blueprint is helping buildings turn the buildings themselves into power plants. As a collaborative, they're able to generate and store enough energy to be a utility, and it's quite amazing. And just another example of how, again, from the bottom up, the city itself is redefining itself. And we see these lines increasingly blurring, where instead of just receiving services down to the individual, the city is being shaped.
Thank you. Deb's Lyft and the other transportation network companies in many ways are the first connection that many citizens have had with a tangible smart city. What does the smart city look like from your seat over the next few years? What can we expect, especially from the mobility companies?
Yeah, that's a great question. And for Lyft, we take sort of a broader thought when we think about what is a smart city or what is the future of cities. And it's recognizing that a smart city is a city where you don't have to own a car to get around. And that's going to mean that there's a role for digital connectivity playing into that, but there's also an infrastructure connection too, and making sure that we're actually working together, both the private sector and the public sector, to create an ecosystem where car ownership isn't mandatory, but it's optional. And so what we're starting to see, I just want to remind everyone that Lyft is actually only a 6-year-old company. And so it's really important to keep that in mind, because right now we're talking about rideshare and autonomous vehicles and these new emerging mobility services like they've been part of the transportation fabric for decades, but it's only been a few years. But in those short years, we've seen a few things. We've seen that having access to a smartphone has really changed how we can think about getting around, and been able to connect us in real-time, on-demand mobility options. And we've also seen that there's this transition from ownership to ridership, and not having to actually own the assets and be able to leverage a suite of options. Sometimes it's public transit, sometimes it's Lyft, sometimes it's walking. And I think those two trends of on-demand technology and multimodal connectivity is really something that's going to drive the transportation industry and cities into the future. A lot of people in this room have probably heard about the concept of mobility as a service, where you're able to access a suite of services and have integrated trip planning, trip payment, being able to see the trade-offs of different services, know when the next bus arrives, know how much it's going to cost to get somewhere. And that's really something that Lyft is starting to think about in particular. One example I'm really excited to share is actually a partnership we're doing in the city of Baltimore with their bike share system, where we've actually integrated thinking about what does it look like when you don't own a car and you rely on a variety of services to get around. How can you create what we're calling a mobility hub, where you can actually physically site a a seamless, integrated pickup drop-off experience and be able to get out of that lift and onto the train, or get from the bike share kiosk to the train. Really thinking about how do we create this compelling user experience that is going to create an alternative to wanting to have to own a car to get around.
So, Rick, Deb's just said something that must have been music to your ears. I'm going to quote you here. I wrote it down. So, you said access to the smartphone has affected how we get around. So, Rick, as we think about multimodal transportation, especially, all of that's going to be dependent on a network. Can you talk a little bit about the timing for the next generation of networks and some of the things that need to happen to get them in place?
You bet. So we're doing a lot of work right now with cities, with municipalities across the country. Many of you in this room might be familiar with what we've done in Sacramento last year, and we're looking to sort of do that across more cities in the United States here. Verizon, most of you know us because of Can You Hear Me Now and mobile devices. We've gone well beyond that through mergers, acquisitions, purchasing a lot of small tech companies. So as we prepare for the next network, so we're currently at 4G, which we all can probably admit is more of a marketing term. Doesn't really quite meet IEEE standards from what they put out years ago. We're working on 5G now, of course. The elements of that are really having a fiber backbone in place. We made an agreement with Corning earlier, or late last year, to purchase about $1 billion of fiber from Corning. That's roughly enough to reach from Earth to Mars. So it's about 33 million miles worth of fiber. We've got to put that fiber in to connect the sites. We've got to put that fiber in to connect to small cells and eventually to 5G sites. It's a big effort. We're working hard, very daily on it. And we've got a lot of moving pieces. One of the challenges we do have in this space and making it happen, and just in the industry in general, is access to the right-of-way. Trying to get reasonable access to the right-of-way is a bit of a challenge. We need to get this in because we got to put this on street lights. We got to put it on, public assets. That's where the key is. In past, we've put our sites on private property mostly for macro cell sites, and understanding the difference economically of a macro cell site. Fee structure is vastly different from a small cell fee structure. So those are a lot of things that we're working on to sort of drive it to the 5G network, because the analogy I like to use, when you go from one generation to the next generation, and unfortunately I've been doing this long enough to have been here since the first generation. 5G, it's all about getting more lanes on the freeway, higher speed limits, and shorter stopping distances, so the latency issue. So that's what we're working on, and these are critical elements when it comes to automated vehicles being deployed in the cities, DSRC radios, the cars talking to each other, having another network that you can verify things on. It's critically important that you have networks from us and the industry in general, for that matter, so that we can enable these applications and services and solutions to help the cities become more livable as more people move to them.
So Verizon and Lyft are building large-scale networks. Both of your companies, I know, are interacting with city, county, state, federal government, top-down. Stonely, you were telling us about a bottom-up approach. What can cities and regions do to nurture an ecosystem of the type of ventures that you're looking to invest in?
Well, it's kind of hard to answer, because really the emergence that we're seeing is truly the emergence of what we're going to define as cities and even city planning is going to dramatically shift from our previous definitions, and there almost is no planning for it. If you look at the growth curve of rideshare over the last decade, and compare that to the growth curve of public transit, light rail, and light rail is very very linear, predictable growth, and rideshare is a hockey stick. But if you look at even more recently, the number of rides by individuals on dockless bikes, it's almost a straight line up. And there's absolutely, I highly doubt there's even one transit planner that had dockless bike share in their plans even a year or two ago. So some of this stuff you just can't plan for. On the other hand, there are some things that are plannable in the sense that shaping the platform for the participants, the citizens to operate. A great example of one shift that we're seeing a lot of states explore is mileage-based fee for road usage. And again, this is a scenario where you really can never predict what people will do on a road or a sidewalk. You know, they may walk, they may run, they may take a bike, they may take a one-wheel, they may hop in a lift or drive their own car. You can set the rules around the road, but you can't really tell people what to ride or not ride. You can nudge their behavior, and so fee-based mileage may be variable based on the choice of vehicle that you're commuting in. Will give people the option to either save money or be more efficient with their time, and ultimately the definition of transportation and mobility will come down to individuals making economic decisions and convenience decisions. So we're seeing more and more of this, that the city is becoming more and more the individual making decisions about how comfortable they want to be in their home, which turns into how much energy load they want to put on the grid, to how quickly they want to get to work, which is turning into a ride share versus walk versus bike decision.
Great. Debs, a major theme of this conference is equity, inclusion, and accessibility. Can you give us some examples of where you are succeeding and maybe where it's a little bit harder to serve all potential customers, all citizens?
Sure, and this is a really important conversation to be having. I know Becky was touching on this earlier, raising some of the tweets about thinking about, what does an accessible, what does an inclusive transportation system look like? And this is a question that Lyft is thinking a lot about as well, because we recognize that as our mission, which is to improve people's lives with the world's best transportation, that means that's improving everyone's lives and making sure that we have a platform that is able to accommodate a variety of people is really critical. So most people, when they think about Lyft, know us as the hot pink app that's on their phone and being able to request a Lyft through that app. But I want to tell you about some of the ways that we're actually starting to think about the digital divide and create a more inclusive platform that actually provides alternative ways to request a Lyft. Thinking about people that may not have access to a smartphone, we actually have a desktop-enabled way to request a Lyft. If you go to m.lyft.com, it's a way to request a ride through a desktop computer. So if you were at a library, you could do this. If you were at home on your computer, you could do this. But we're also going further than that, and we've actually built some really interesting software. We call it Concierge, and this is a dispatching system that we actually make available to retirement homes that we work with, healthcare operators that we're partnering with, transit agencies that we work with, and this is a way to give agents at a call center the ability to actually dispatch a Lyft ride on behalf of another individual. So I could call on my regular phone and speak to an agent at a transit center or speak to the person at the front desk of my retirement home and actually have them book a Lyft ride for me. And they would be able to tell me who my driver is, what their name is, what the license plate number is, what the car is, and be able to do that ride. We're also doing some really interesting integrations with a company called GoGo Grandparent, which creates this really adorable, simple, easy-to-use cell phone for your grandfather or grandmother to use, and you're actually able to request a Lyft ride, again, not having to have a digital enabled smartphone to do that. And on the payment side, thinking about the unbanked population is another really important area for us to be thinking about equity and accessibility. And so we're taking all sorts of pathways of payment into account. Of course, you can add a credit card or a debit card, or you can add Venmo or Apple Pay, something like that. But you can actually also add a prepaid debit card. And this is a really common form of payment for unbanked populations. And actually on the Lyft platform, about 9% of all payment transactions happening on Lyft are through prepaid debit cards, which really highlights the variety and diversity of people using Lyft. But this is definitely an area for opportunity and continued improvement. I think an area that we're beginning to think more about, and frankly is an area for collaboration across the public and private sectors, thinking about how can we actually bring more wheelchair accessible vehicles onto the platform and making this a more accessible platform? One of the challenges that we have right now is that we are a peer-to-peer platform, and the reality is that most people don't own a wheelchair accessible vehicle with a ramp. And so being able to think about how we can actually provide equal service levels when we have a fleet of vehicles that's predominantly not wheelchair accessible vehicles is really challenging, and that's a supply issue. And so we're beginning to work in some partnerships to leverage, third-party fleets that may have wheelchair accessible vehicles, thinking about what opportunities might there be to actually cross-dispatch wheelchair accessible vehicles to people who may not need a wheelchair accessible vehicle, but that can actually keep the driver busy so they're not sitting around just waiting for a smaller percentage of rides. This is really an area that is an opportunity for us to work together to figure out.
Great. And Rick, from Verizon's seat, the equity, access, inclusion, especially since in many ways you'll be the provider of 5G that will enable a whole new world of connectivity, how do you think about who gets it first, who gets it next, the sequencing aspect to it, and how you can accelerate that rollout?
Yeah, well, first, it's all going to be demand-driven, where we need to augment the network is where we're going to be focused first. But we do take digital equity very seriously. As a matter of fact, this last fall, we sponsored a movie on the National Geographic, or a documentary on the National Geographic Channel from Rory Kennedy called, I always forget the name, forgive me here. It's Without a Net, the Digital Divide in America. And it's focused on the digital divide in public education across the country. We looked at different ways of, from a hardware perspective, where are they missing from a hardware perspective, where are they missing from a communications perspective, and then also where are they missing from a training perspective. Everyone's probably familiar with what happened in Los Angeles with the iPad deployment from 2 years ago and how that sort of went sideways on them. And so we don't have the answers. We don't think we know the answers, but we know there's a problem there. It needs to be solved. Part of the agreement we did with City of Sacramento last year in addressing digital equity was offering Wi-Fi in select parks that the cities told us were important to them. As you'll see in the movie as well, some of the creative solutions they did were on school buses. They put Wi-Fi routers on the school buses, so not only could the kids do homework to and from school, but also in the evenings they'd park the school buses in the neighborhoods, so they'd create a hotspot in the low-income neighborhoods. So those are some of the creative ideas that were done in that movie, but it's an issue. We're not going to have all the answers. We're going to rely on a lot of folks for input on that, but some of the things that we're looking at and the ways we're addressing it.
Great. And Stonely, in the venture angel investing world and the accelerator world, obviously there's been a lot of press about the lack of equity and inclusion and representation from many communities. What have you observed, and how is that barrier, that lack of access that many entrepreneurs have that want to participate in this urban tech environment, how is that being addressed from your seat?
Yeah, this actually helps me wrap the answer to the previous question that I didn't quite complete. So, solutions can come from anywhere, but the resources to turn those solutions into reality are not evenly distributed, they're not fairly distributed. Most of venture capital comes from the two coasts, predominantly the NorCal, and the most innovative cities around issues like procurement, which is access to the city as a customer for a solution. The most innovative areas are very specific, already dense cities. And so if we want to enhance inclusion and diversity in the solution sets that we see, then we need to find a way to more evenly distribute the resources and the opportunities. And so the venture capital world is figuring itself out on that part, and to some degree there are a number of cities and local governments and states and even the federal government that are trying to spur up early stage innovation investment more evenly throughout the country. But something that the folks in this room could directly impact is the challenge around procurement, which is still very fragmented, very confusing, and the bar is still too high for innovators to understand and access. And it's something we push very hard to see progress on, so that more great opportunities get to see the light of day, or at least a shot. Don't have the answer to how to fix procurement. We've made some investments along those lines. And then in my previous answer, I talked a little bit I talked at length about how the future of cities will truly be shaped by emerging technology and individual decisions, and how challenging it is to plan ahead for what those technologies might be and what the decisions folks might actually make. But what I left out is that there is a key role that the city will always be able to play, and that is the role of being able to incentivize one choice versus the other. And some of the research that we're doing, one in particular with IBM, is looking at the rebate programs throughout the country. And there is very clearly a gap in rebates such as around energy efficiency or transportation that reach urban or low-income communities or underserved communities. And so part of that is because most rebates are for households where there is one person managing the utility access versus low-income generally are multifamily, shared pooled utility, and so there's a disconnect between incentives, and so there aren't many rebates shaped around that. And so large swaths of cities, the lower income and underserved population of cities, aren't even given the chance to modify their behavior for the betterment of the city because there aren't programs that are focused on them. And so we need to fix that. We're exploring how to see more rebates and behavioral nudges that the city can do to help the individual help the city.
Great. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I invite you to move to the microphones if you have a question. We have about 10 minutes left. So Rick and Debs, let me ask you, you both have to work with a lot of governments at a lot of different levels, and we've heard throughout the conference some of the stovepiping that happens that makes strategic decision-making more challenging in the urban environment. So if you were mayor of a city and had the opportunity to either reorganize or bring a different structure to the table, what might that look like?
Sure. So this is a really easy answer to me. I would just hire Leslie Knope to run my city department. How many of you are Parks and Rec fans out there? Okay, good. So the joke landed pretty well. But seriously, I mean, when you think about someone like Leslie Knope, for those of you that don't watch Parks and Rec, first of all, you should go home and watch it. It's amazing. Leslie Knope is a really motivated and passionate public servant. And I think that one of the most important things that Lyft sees in trying to work together with cities and do partnerships around leveraging Lyft's network for certain use cases that are hard for fixed rail or 40-foot buses to provide, or thinking about the future of curb space and doing pilot programs to convert parking to pick up drop-off. What's so important to working with the cities and making this happen is having a strong internal champion that really wants to be a bureaucracy hacker and find a way to make this happen. Stonely's totally right. Procurement is one of the biggest roadblocks of really being able to work together. And I don't know how many of you work in cities and understand the ins and out of your procurement policy, or how many of you in the audience have tried to do work actually physically with a city, and the first thing that you get when you want to bring this really exciting idea or new way of thinking or a service is a 400-page RFP that asks you to talk to 50 different people in your company, if you even have that many people, to get legal advice, to put together individual resumes of every single person that would be working on this project. I see Jerry Tierney laughing up here in the front because we've worked together on some projects, and it's really challenging, even for mature companies like Lyft, to navigate procurement. And so I have a lot of empathy for the smaller startups that want to work together with government. Because there's just a really high barrier to actually getting your foot in the door to work together. So some of the advice that I have as cities think about, how do we do public-private partnerships right, is to actually focus on what my former employer, Code for America, calls is the basics. Don't focus on, the sexy, innovative thing. Focus on the unsexy things like procurement and really get that in order first to lay a framework for working together. And that can be really small fixes that go a long way. Like, instead of structuring all of your contracts for multi-year engagements where you have to agree up front what you want that end deliverable to be, that's really hard for the private sector, and in particular startups, to really be able to envision what is our service going to look like 3 years from now. I've spoken with transit agencies that have wanted to work with us and said, can you guarantee that your service is going to look and feel and be able to offer this 4 years from now? And this was a few years ago when I started at Lyft, and I was like, Lyft wasn't even around 4 years ago. It's really hard for us to be able to make those kinds of commitments. And so being able to break up projects that you're working on into smaller bite-sized pieces, rather than having a waterfall style of IT development, really focusing on a more agile, iterative process where you can have smaller pieces and kind of iterate on that process. That's how I really see starting to be able to work together.
Rick, what does your new city structure look like?
Well, it's going to be a little bit different, of course. So I love the NOPE analogy. There's a website here somewhere in Oregon that does the NOPE awards for city managers and stuff like that, and that's always fun to follow up on. We're in a little bit different of a position. We have relationships with most cities across the country at a lot of different levels. I remember having been with Verizon off and on since before its inception. You get in the bad habit of, in a large company, I get a RFP or something along those lines, I just toss it over the fence to the legal department or the RFP department, and they take care of things for us in the field. But in one of my startups, it's like I worked with our contract attorney, and he said, all right, let's get the pencil and paper out and let's figure this out. And it's like, oh, wow, reality check here, and 30 people or 30-person organization. So it's interesting. Trying to find that perfect employee at a company or at a city is a challenge because you want somebody that's going to have what I like to call the recent college graduate fire for technology and change. But you want somebody with the experience in the systems and the bureaucracy. You want someone that has, who knows the ins and outs of the state organization, maybe or the city organization that has experience working in this government, but also has experience in the private industry. So it's a really mixed bag of things, what you want from somebody who can really understand what smart city requirements are. Some organizations are doing great, but having a central person at the highest level is critically important, and that's what we're looking for.
In Stoneleigh, the two companies to your left obviously have the attention of the folks in the room that represent government especially. The companies that you're seeking are obviously below the radar for the most part, and like Lyft many years ago, should cities not fear but be very aware that if they ignore the smaller tech companies, they could be the next big disruptor like Lyft and its peers have been to kind of circumvent the intended regulations?
Yeah, no, it's a great question because, yeah, I think that the rules have changed. I don't think a startup starting now can run the same playbook that Lyft or Uber or Airbnb played, and that's because for both better and for worse, cities are more aware of the potential for disruption and disruption via regulatory innovation, quote unquote. And so the cities tend to be more responsive and less dismissive when something shows up. Again, thinking about dockless bike share, one city, I think it was Seattle or San Francisco, had a rule in place before it even showed up. They're like, if you guys even think about littering our streets with bikes, you're going to get a fine. And the responsiveness has actually become quite amazing. So for good in that cities are no longer just asleep, but also for bad because you have innovation like a company, Josephine, that was born in Oakland that was helping households make and share food with each other. It's an economy that already happens and exists, but they were bringing it to the light, enabling more safe conditions and more fairness, and regulations just kept moving ahead of them to make sure that they couldn't grow or thrive, and ultimately they had to shut down. And again, we certainly should continue to be cognizant and aware of threats to the city, and we certainly want to make sure to whatever power we can around nudges or regulation, we keep out the obvious negative consequences of some innovation. But by being hyper aware and hyper and really quick to trigger on shifting regulations, it seems that what's resulted is actually a hindrance of more innovation as opposed to enabling more innovation. Housing should be an easy win. Everybody wants to solve the housing challenge, You know, it's a good thing if people want to live in your city, yet it's still so hard to build dense housing, in spite of all of the innovation that's come out the gate over the last decade to help do so. So we don't just need to be more responsive from a regulatory perspective. We need to be positively responsive from a regulatory perspective, as Deb's mentioned. Yeah, I mean, there are approaches to making things into maybe bite-sized chunks that make them more appealing to test more enabling regulations out. I don't know what the answer is, but we need to do something.
Great. I want to make time available. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask? Yes.
Good morning. My name is Casey Gifford. I'm with King County Metro Transit. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts. I have a question for Debs. I think it's great that Lyft is working on ways to make its service more accessible. I'm wondering if there's any movement happening in terms of driver training on how to serve customers that might have a cognitive or physical disability that might not require a wheelchair accessible vehicle, but they still need, you know, some assistance in some way.
Yeah, that's a good question. And right now, one of the challenges we have is, you know, our drivers are classified as independent contractors, and that framework does create pretty strict requirements about what you can and can't do, and some of the more sensitivity type trainings for, you know, paratransit type services make that difficult. But that being said, sort of going back to what I was alluding to, we believe that partnering with third-party operators can be a way to start unlocking that. And so we've worked across the country with a lot of really interesting nonprofits that are able to not only bring their expertise of wheelchair accessible vehicles, but also having drivers that have undergone some of these sensitivity type trainings to help folks with cognitive impairments. I think this is an area that we've tested in a few cases, you know, most notably in Boston with the MBTA, as well as actually in Northern California with Sonoma, the new SMART train that opened. We worked with a local nonprofit called Whistle Stop, looking at how we can really be more responsive to that demographic. So thank you.
Anyone else have a question? Or okay, please.
Hi, my name is Luke. I'm a student at the University of Oregon. Stonely mentioned in the beginning that the possibilities for these emerging technologies to really form from the bottom up kind of places a heavy responsibility on you guys as companies. At what point in the interest of equity and efficiency do you begin working with other private companies that have similar interests as yours, such as Lyft and Uber competing over the same market? When do you guys step back and decide that to be more efficient, it might be better to not focus everything where the money might be the best, but spread it out so that everyone has more equal access? Or Verizon is laying out this new fiber cable. If AT&T or Sprint are doing the same thing, at what point do you guys decide to choose different portions of the city so everyone has equal access, not just specific points?
You want the first one? I'll address my portion of that real quick. So, you know, we want to plan our fiber rings accordingly and bring it to the market. You know, our ideal tenant is going to be ourselves, first of all, and connect our cell sites and our small cells to our fiber. But we believe that, you know, in Portland, I believe the number is 54% of the homes have access to one ISP provider here in the Portland metropolitan area. We'd like to help compete in that market and bring competition across the board. So it's not really working with the other carriers to make sure each part of the city, you know, is carved out for each carrier, but creating a competitive environment across the city, regardless of income equalities in the city and in the area. We're going to go where the people are.
Do you want to address? Okay. So in investing, there's a challenge you run into once in a while when looking at new companies called portfolio conflict. And you know, you meet a company that you're excited about, a team that you're excited about, but they're working on something that's close enough to a company you've already invested in that you worry that they'll end up competing with each other. And our inclination is to figure out how they might actually complement each other and avoid bumping into each other, but actually enhance each other's offerings. Doesn't always work out that way. Early stage founders are very sensitive to the potential and possibilities. But that is to say that we try to get them thinking collaboratively very early. As a matter of fact, there's an example of this just from a conversation this morning. A founder that we recently invested in is currently fundraising and doing really well in her fundraise, but she wanted advice from another founder that we'd worked with about a particular investor, a particularly large investor that they had received funding from, follow-on funding from. And in their conversation, her company, an aerial imagery company, and his company, a transit efficiency platform, they realized that their offerings actually complement each other, and that they'll likely work together to help make a combined, more enhanced offering. So we inclined towards figuring out ways, and we found many, many opportunities in our portfolio to enhance and create composite offerings for cities. So we're all for collaboration and equalizing access to innovation.
Please join me in thanking this panel.